Hello, fifth graders. Welcome to our next math lesson. We're taking a look at chapter 13-4. This lesson is entitled Interpret Numerical Expressions, and we're going to start on page 754. So if you'd be so kind as to make sure your book's open to that page, we're going to go through a couple of examples that are found there. Hopefully it will help you to understand this lesson a little better. Now, up until this point, we've been dealing with numeric expressions. And last time we did numeric expressions where we didn't necessarily have to find the answer. Today we're going to be doing something very similar to that, where we don't have to find the answer, but we're going to take a look at the expressions, and based upon the expressions, we're going to figure out which one of these are bigger, which ones are smaller, or in some cases, which ones are equal, without actually having to find the exact answer. So if I believe that on the top of page 754, there's a problem about clown costumes. I wrote it here on the lesson. It says Jimmy's clown costume requires this much fabric. There's 7/8 yards fabric plus 1/2 yard plus 1 3/4 yards of fabric. That's how much fabric Jimmy's clown costume is going to take to make. His dad is also going to have a clown costume, but his requires this much. We're going to take 3 times the 7/8 plus the 1/2 plus the 1 3/4 yards. The questions asked is, how does the amount of fabric needed for the dad's costume, how is that going to compare? Compare is the idea we're taking a look at here, to the amount needed for Jimmy's costume. Now, in mathematics, whenever you hear the word compare, that's where you're going to have that greater than, less than, or equal to symbol. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be comparing these two items together. Now, on this next slide, what I did was I took a look at those two numbers, and I noticed something about those numbers. The 7/8 plus 1/2 plus 1 3/4, that's Jimmy's. I also noticed that in Dad's, those exact same numbers are in Dad's. So that's why I highlighted both of those in red. The only difference is that with Dad's, I'm going to take 3 times that amount. Okay, so what we did is I wrote it out the long way like this. So this right here, this part here, this right here, this represents Jimmy. Okay, this part over here represents Dad's number. Both Jimmy and both Dad, they both have the 7/8 plus the 1/2 plus the 1 3/4. They both have that. So if we just had that only, we would say that Jimmy and Dad's would be equal to each other. But we noticed that with Dad's number, we're going to multiply that by 3. And by multiplying that by 3, that means we're going to actually make Dad's number bigger. I don't know how much bigger, I don't know what these numbers are when I add them together, but I do know that this number is 3 times bigger. And since I know that this number is going to be 3 times bigger, that tells me that this first number is going to be less than the second number. So I might even put that less than symbol in there. And I know that because this side over here is 3 times bigger than this side is over here. Now, in this lesson here, what they're saying is without doing any of the calculations, which means without doing any adding or subtracting, we're going to describe how does expression A compare to expression B. How does A compare to B? So here's my first one. I have A. I've got 8 times 41,516 minus 987. And you should notice that this is in parentheses. And if you remember back from our earlier lesson, it talks about how we always do what's inside parentheses first. Okay? And on B is just 41,516 minus 987. The first thing I would do is look at what numbers do they have in common. You should notice that A has this subtraction problem. You should notice that B has this subtraction problem. Those are the exact same subtraction problem. But you should notice that A, you're going to multiply that by 8. So when it says describe, don't just say, oh, it's 8 bigger. When it says describe how expression A compares to expression B, this is what you're going to write on your paper. You're going to write expression A is either how much bigger or how much smaller than expression B. And we notice that expression A, if I'm multiplying that by 8, that means that A is probably going to be 8 times bigger. So I would say, oops, I thought this was going to be an eraser, but apparently it wasn't. What I'm going to say is expression A is 8 times bigger. So put 8 times, and then we're going to put bigger. Write that right out there. So I'm saying this expression A is 8 times bigger, or 8 times greater, however you want to say it. But expression A is 8 times bigger than B. And I know that because I'm multiplying that by 8. Let's take a look at this next section here. I have A is 613 plus 15,090. And then I'm going to divide that by 4. This one is 613. I'm going to add 15,090. Notice that both of them have this addition problem. So right now, if it was just that, we would say that both of them are equal. But you're noticing that A is divided by 4, which means I'm reducing this. I'm cutting it into 4 smaller parts. And since I'm dividing it by 4, that means I'm actually making A smaller. Okay, and so I want to write that as an expression. So that means A is going to be smaller. How much smaller? We might even say it's 4 times smaller. So there's a couple ways you could write that. You could say it's going to be 4 times smaller, or since you're dividing by 4, you could say it's 1/4 of, oops, not off. Has fun time writing here. It could be 1/4 of. So there's a couple ways you could write that. You could say it's either going to be, the expression is 4 times smaller than expression B, or you could say 1/4 of it because you're making it smaller. This one is a little bit trickier. You might see problems that are like this, and I wanted to go through at least one of these with you today. Here, we've got a couple of sets of parentheses. And you should notice that between A and B, there's a number that they all have in common. They all have 418. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore those right now. And I'm even going to ignore the multiplication parts. And the only things I'm going to look at are the fractions. I have 1/4, I have 1/2, and I have 3/4. Well, what I want to do is I want to combine these two numbers first. And in order for me to combine them, I'm going to do what the expression is right here. So the first thing I want to do is actually add 1/4 and 1/2 together. Because they all have 418, I'm going to ignore that. They all have multiplication, I'm going to ignore all that. But I have the 1/4 plus the 1/2. So I want to add those two numbers together. And hopefully you remember that whenever you go to add fractions together, you have to have common denominators. So the common denominator between 2 and 4 is going to be 4. So I'm going to keep that 1/4 where it is. That doesn't change, but I am going to change the 1/2. I'm going to multiply both the numerator and the denominator. I'm going to multiply both those numbers by 2. And by doing that, I'm going to create a new fraction, which is 2/4. Because 1/2 and 2/4, they're different numbers, but they're the same value. So I'm going to add these two numbers together. I got 1/4 plus 2/4. And when I add those together, that gives me 3/4. Okay, so when I add 1/4 and 2/4 together, that's 3/4. So then you notice the top one has 3/4 and the other one has 3/4 as well. So that probably tells you, hey, they're both the same. They are both equal to each other. So I'm going to say expression A is equal. And put equal, and I'm going to put equal to expression B. Okay? So when it tells you to describe the relationship, don't just write A times bigger. Well, what's A times bigger? Is A 8 times bigger than B, or is B 8 times bigger than A? So you got to be a little bit more specific in that particular section when it says to describe the relationship. So you should say A is equal to B. Okay, or in this case, you might say expression A is 1/4 or 4 times smaller than B, however you want to say that. All right, so here, another part of the section is let's figure out if there's greater than, less than, or equal to without actually finding the exact answers. So if you notice, this first one here, what you're looking for is what do they have in common? So the first one here, they both have a 5 plus 4. So we're going to kind of ignore that for right now. This side here, we're going to take that number and we're going to make it 7 times bigger. This side over here, we're going to make this 22 times bigger. Now, we're obviously making both sides bigger, but which one is going to be a bigger value? The 7, multiplying by 7, or multiplying by 22? And I hope you understand that multiplying something by 22 is going to give you a lot bigger than multiplying by 7. So even though you're making both of these numbers bigger, this side is going to become a greater value because you're multiplying by a bigger number. So we're going to say that this side here is the bigger side. So we're going to say that this side here is smaller than the second number. So we're going to put a less than symbol in there. Okay. Let's take a look at this next one here. Again, they both have 7.1 divided by 5. So they both have those. So we're not going to worry about that. We're going to take a look at what's going on here. So for this side here, we're taking that number and we're adding 8.2. And this side here, we're adding 8.2. So it looks like we're adding something to both sides. And it looks like we're adding the exact same amount to both sides. So even though both sides are actually getting bigger, they're both getting bigger by the same amount. And since they're both getting bigger by the same amount, we're going to say that these two are equal to each other. Let's look at this next one here. Again, it looks like it's the same problem, but it's actually not. A lot of times what the people will do is they'll look inside the parentheses, but if you notice inside the parentheses, they're not the same. They both have 284, but they don't have the same number here. But you should notice that they both have divide by 30. So obviously they're going to be getting smaller. So I'm not going to worry about these two right here are what they have in common so far. They both have 284. Okay. So they both have 284, but what's happening to 284? This side I'm making it bigger by 910. And this side I'm making it bigger by adding 7,816. Now, between those two here, even though both of these numbers are getting bigger, which one is going to have a greater value to it? And hopefully we see that this side here has the greater value. So we're saying that this number here is actually going to be a little bit bigger because we're adding 7,000. This side is only adding 900. So we're going to say that this number here is smaller. So we're going to put that less than symbol in there. Okay. Our last one here. Again, this side has 5,366 minus 17. This has 5,366 minus 117. So they both have that number there. Now this side is we're multiplying by something. So we might think, oh, we're multiplying, we're making it bigger. But you're noticing that I'm multiplying by a number that's smaller than 1. If I were to multiply this by 2, that means we're making it bigger. If we're multiplying by 3, it's getting bigger. But when you multiply by a number that's smaller than 1, believe it or not, you're actually making it smaller. So even though it says multiplication, we're multiplying by a number that's smaller than 1. And by doing that, we're actually going to make this side smaller. So since we're making this side smaller, and this side is actually the same, nothing's happened to it, staying where it is, we would say this side here is smaller. And this side is actually going to be the bigger number. So we'd say less than. Okay, so the key here for today is we didn't actually have to add 5 plus 4 and then multiply by 6. We didn't have to add 5 plus 4 and multiply by 22. We just knew that multiplying by 22 gives you a bigger value than multiplying by 7. So that's what you're doing for this week, 5th graders. You don't actually have to find the exact answer. You're just using the information to try to calculate which number would actually be bigger. Well, this side, they're both adding 8.2, so they got to be equal to each other. All right, so for your assignment for today's lesson is we're going to take a look at pages 757 and 758. I'm going to have you do numbers 1 through 9. And on the back side, I believe I have you doing numbers 11 and 12. So you can go ahead and cross out numbers 10 and numbers 13. Okay? As always, if you have any questions, again, don't be afraid to relook at this video if you need to, or don't be afraid to reach out to me. I am here to help you the best that I can. So I hope you have good luck on this lesson. If you have no questions, go ahead and get started, and we will see you with the next lesson.